Back at it again with the Mobius Dickus, Chapter 45, The Affidavit. If you're curious about the title of this chapter, the affidavit is a reference, obviously, to the legal document, an affidavit, which is a written statement confirmed by oath or affirmation to some testimony in court. So what Ishmael is doing is he's saying, look, I told you in the previous chapter that these whales, they're unique and they can destroy boats. But in case I didn't convince you, let me show you what I know. Let me testify. Let me show my truth. Okay? So he asserts that he's known 3 times when a whale was harpooned, escaped, and killed after an interval of time, right? The first passage I want to look at, I put in blue because I think it's just funny. I think it's just humorous. He talks about these whales, which are famously well known for being savage and for being killers. And it says, but not only did each of these famous whales enjoy great individual celebrity, nay, you may call it an ocean-wide renown, not only was he famous in life, and now is immortal in forecastle stories after death, but he was admitted into all the rights, privileges, and distinctions of a name, had as much a name as indeed Cambyses, or Caesar. So Cambyses was a Persian king, okay, the son of Cyrus, and of course we know who Caesar was. Gaius Julius Caesar, if we're to use Latin pronunciation. Was it not so, O Timor Tom, thou famed Leviathan, scarred like an iceberg, who so long didst lurk in the oriental straits of that name, whose spout was oft seen from the palmy beach of Ombay? I thought that this might be a misspelling of Bombay, but then I looked it up, and apparently there is an island called Ombay in the Strait of Timor, near current-day East Timor. Was it not so, O New Zealand Jack, thou terror of all cruisers that crossed their wakes in the vicinity of the Tattoo Land? Was it not so, or Morquan, king of Japan, whose lofty jet they say at times assumed the semblance of a snow-white cross against the sky? Was it not so, O Don Miguel, thou Chilean whale, marked like an old tortoise with mystic hieroglyphics upon the back? In plain prose, here are the 4 whales as well known to the students of cetacean history as Marius or Sula to the classic scholar. So first off, I just find the idea of whales as celebrity pretty funny. Like, can't you imagine paparazzi following these whales and asking them who they're dating, etc., etc.? I think it's funny. I think their names are funny. Additionally, if you are curious, Marius and Sula were competing political rivals in the 2nd decade of the 1st century BC, so that's 90 BC to 80 BC. Essentially, Marius was overreaching in terms of his power and got exiled. Sula was a very successful general who went off to fight a war as generals would. Marius came back and to Rome, which was illegal, with troops, which was illegal, and teamed up with a guy named Kina, who was also ambitious. And Marius and Kina essentially used their troops in Rome to slaughter their political enemies, which is not chill. And eventually that led to a lot of bloodshed. And then Sula came back and crossed the Palmarium with his Roman soldiers, which was also not chill, and deposed Marius and Kina. And then Sula became the first dictator of Roman history. People think of Julius Caesar as being the first dictator of a kind, but really Sula was, though he resigned his dictatorship as soon as possible, he was essentially the most powerful political person in Rome until his death, because he used these brutal things called prescriptions in 83 BC to slaughter anyone who was disloyal to him. So anyway, fun little Roman history note. Why does he say Marius and Sula? I don't think it elucidates the passage all that much. Next passage I found funny. This one's probably even more funny because it's a metacognitive, postmodern comment from Melville in 1851. I've said it once and I'll say it again. I cannot stress to you how crazy it is that Melville was being metatextual in 1851. But here you go. So ignorant are most landsmen of some of the plainest and most palpable wonders of the world that, without some hints touching the plain facts, historical and otherwise, of the fishery, they might scout at Moby Dick as a monstrous fable, or still worse and more detestable, a hideous and intolerable allegory. Okay, that's a huge wink to the audience. Obviously, to the audience who's reading this book, of course Moby Dick is an allegory, right? It is something that is teaching us a lesson symbolically. Even if you're like, what? No, Mr. D, what if Moby Dick is just a whale? Then he wouldn't be an allegory. But even Moby Dick just being a whale would still engage with the themes of chapter 36 and chapter 42 because it would contradict Ahab and confirm the emptiness of a mechanical world, which is pondered in chapter 42. So there is no way that this book is not in some way an allegory, and Melville is very cheekily winking at the reader to pick up on that. Now we go to the next passage I want to look at, which I'm not going to say is connected to many of the big ideas we've been tracking. It's a classic Melvillian one-off. I'm just going to throw this out there and let you think about it. And it has to do with economics and capitalism and the means of production, etc., etc. So, do you suppose that the poor fellow there, who this moment be perhaps caught by the whale line off the coast of New Guinea, is being carried down to the bottom of the sea by the sounding Leviathan? Okay, just so you know the literal meaning here, there's going to be a lot more talk about whale line in future chapters, but essentially just think about this, right? If you're trying to kill a whale, you need to have some way to retrieve its body, right? So these harpoons are often tied to a line of rope slash, sometimes I think it can be even laced with steel, that if you get a harpoon into the whale, the ship can follow it. Of course, this means that if you get a harpoon into a whale and it starts thrashing about, that whale line is going to be flinging all over the place, and you could easily get caught in it and pulled to the bottom of the ocean as the whale tries to go in an opposite direction and the boat follows it. That's just the literal meaning there. But now let's get to the thematics. Do you suppose that that poor fellow's name will appear in the newspaper obituary you read tomorrow at your breakfast? No, because the mails are very irregular between here and New Guinea. A nice little subtle understatement by Melville. Yeah, I bet they're very irregular between New Guinea and New England. In fact, did you ever hear what might be called regular news, direct or indirect, from New Guinea? Yet I will tell you that upon one particular voyage which I made to the Pacific, among many others we spoke 30 different ships, every one of which had had a death by a whale, some of them more than one, and 3 that had lost a boat's crew. For God's sake, be economical with your lamps and candles, the products which are made using the spermaceti oil from sperm whales. Not a gallon you burn, but at least 1 drop of man's blood was spilled for it. So to me, I find this an interesting reminder of the real human cost of industry. I mean, people who are well aware in 2020 about where they buy their fair trade coffee or their fair trade chocolate or care about workers' rights should find some solidarity here from a writer in 1851 who is reminding the reader, look, like, you don't get that oil for free, dog. Like, there's blood in that oil. It's a dangerous process. Now, returning back to our chapter 36-42 dichotomy, here's another line which just brings up this difficult question again to the forefront of the reader's mind. The point is this: the sperm whale is in some cases sufficiently powerful, knowing, and judiciously malicious, as with direct aforethought to stave in, utterly destroy, and sink a large ship, and what is more, a sperm whale has done it. Okay, so that's pretty straight up, right? It's that there's seemingly a kind of judicious, powerful, knowing malice of the sperm whale. That seems to be more in the line of Ahab's interpretation in chapter 36. He then gives an example of the 1820 ship Essex out of Nantucket. Okay, before I go into talking about that last passage there from Owen Chance, one of the first mate, I believe, aboard the Essex, I want to give you a little bit of a fun laugh at the fact that Hollywood, in fact, produced a very, very Hollywood-esque version of the real story, the real true tale of the 1820 attack on the Essex by a sperm whale, starring some of your favorite, that's right, your favorite Marvel movie actors. Let's pull that up real quick. There's Thor. There's Spider-Man in the story of the Essex, right? Which is attacked. It's a true story, right? There were true survivors of the attack on the Essex. But what I'm interested in is what it says that Owen Chase, the chief mate of the Essex at the time of the tragedy, says. So I'm going to skip to the footnote here. Let's see, pull that up, go to footnotes. And here's what Chase says from the Essex. Every fact seemed to warrant in me concluding that it was anything but chance which directed his operations, the whales. He made 2 several attacks upon the ship at a short interval between them, both of which, according to their direction, were calculated to do us the most injury by being made ahead and thereby combining the speed of the 2 objects for the shock, to effect which the exact maneuvers which he made were necessary. His aspect was most horrible, and pay attention to this phrase, and such as indicated resentment and fury. He came directly from the shoal which we had just before entered, in which we had struck 3 of his companions, as if fired with revenge for their sufferings. Again, quote, at all events the whole circumstances taken together, all happening before mine own eyes and producing, at the time, impressions in my mind of decided, calculating mischief on the part of the whale, many of which impressions I cannot now recall, induce me to be satisfied that I am correct in my opinion. Okay, so it seems to me that Chase's account is more evidence for Ahab's interpretation, that there's this inscrutable malice, this intentionality, there's this thought behind what happens in the universe, that it's not just a random whale attack, that the whale is thinking, the whale knows what's going on, that the universe has a plan, that the universe is constructed with a kind of willfulness, be it God's willfulness or the willfulness of things in nature, but they're not just brain chemistry, they're not just atoms moving in the patterns they have to move because they're determined. You know, this whale makes choices. This whale adapts to its situation. It attacks people out of revenge. It doesn't just do what it's programmed to do. It can think, it can decide, it can choose, right? So, okay, that's seemingly more evidence for Ahab's interpretation. Same thing here with the discussion of Commodore J. Let's read that one. This is, by the way, the dash thing is a weird 19th century habit that 19th century writers had because they thought that it would make stories more relatable if you didn't know the exact name, because then you wouldn't get lost in the particulars. But obviously Melville is happy to give you particulars, so it's a bit confusing. Commodore J, then commanding an American sloop of war of the first class, happened to be dining with a party of whaling captains on board a Nantucket ship in the harbor of Oahu, then the Sandwich Islands, of course, Oahu being Hawaii now. Conversation turning upon whales, the Commodore was pleased to be skeptical touching the amazing strength ascribed to them by the professional gentlemen present. He says, "No way these sperm whales are as powerful and as malicious as you say." He peremptorily denied, for example, that any whale could so smite his stout sloop of war as to cause her to leak so much as a thimbleful. Very good, but there is more coming. Some weeks later, the Commodore set sail in this impregnable craft for Valparaiso, but he was stopped on the way by a portly sperm whale that begged a few moments' confidential business with him. That business consisted in fetching the Commodore's craft such a thwack that with all his pumps going, he made straight for the nearest port to heave down and repair. I'm not superstitious, but I consider the Commodore's interview with that whale as providential. Was not Saul of Tarsus converted from unbelief by a similar fright? I tell you, the sperm whale will stand no nonsense. Okay, so once again, in this example, especially with its reference to Saul of Tarsus, who obviously becomes Paul after seeing a divine image from God, the Commander J example is more evidence of Ahab's interpretation, this time explicitly couched in the register and rhetoric of divine meaning, right? Whale as God's vengeance, or whale as God's will, right? Ahab has transgressed, he is the Promethean figure, and perhaps he will meet with a whale which represents the same kind of divine intervention that Saul received when he became Paul. And then finally, I want to look at this last passage where, again, Ahab's interpretation seems to be confirmed by these other accounts when it says, "Again, it is very often observed that if the sperm whale once struck is allowed time to rally, he then acts not so often with blind rage," which would be the mechanical, deterministic, brain chemistry response, "as with willful," look at that word, we love willful, "deliberate designs of destruction to his pursuers. Nor is it without conveying some eloquent indication of his character, that upon being attacked he will frequently open his mouth and retain it in that dread expansion for several consecutive minutes." So once again, chapter 45 seems to bring up, once again, this chapter 36-42 split, and seemingly be siding way more with Ahab than with the whiteness of the whale chapter. Okay, Chapter 45 in the books. I haven't seen In the Heart of the Sea. You know what? I'm not going to lie. The trailer made me want to watch it. It looks kind of like a good, fun action film. And I like how the trailer was presented. I'll see you guys in Chapter 46.